I'm Elena Voss, and I spent 15 years being the family joke, the single mother who couldn't keep a man, the sister whose life choices were whispered about at every gathering, the daughter whose existence seemed to embarrass everyone. But on December 24th, as my sister Vanessa stood in our parents' pristine dining room and announced that at least her children had a real father, she had no idea that the quiet woman she'd been mocking for over a decade had just become one of the most formidable divorce attorneys in the tri-state area. And the manila envelope my colleague was about to hand her, well, that contained documentation that would unravel everything she thought she knew about her perfect marriage and her perfect life. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The Voss family had always operated on a strict hierarchy of worth, and I had been placed firmly at the bottom from the moment I announced my pregnancy at 22. My daughter Iris came into this world during my final year of college, the result of a relationship that dissolved the instant those two pink lines appeared on the test. Her father, a charming graduate student named Marcus, vanished so completely that I sometimes wondered if I'd imagined him entirely. One day we were planning our future together, and the next his phone was disconnected, his apartment emptied, and his friends suddenly unable to remember his forwarding address. I was left alone, terrified, and facing the monumental task of becoming a mother while finishing my degree in an apartment so small that the crib barely fit beside my bed. My family's reaction to my pregnancy had been nothing short of catastrophic. My mother, Patricia, a woman who measured success exclusively through social standing and appearances, looked at me with such disappointment that I felt physically ill. My father, Robert, a corporate attorney who'd built his reputation on being ruthless and uncompromising, simply stopped speaking to me for 3 months. But it was my older sister Vanessa who truly made those early years unbearable. She was 26 at the time, newly engaged to her college sweetheart Graham, a rising executive at a pharmaceutical company with a trust fund that could have fed a small country. Vanessa took every opportunity to contrast her perfect trajectory with my catastrophic choices, always with a smile that never reached her eyes and words wrapped in false concern. At family dinners, she would place her manicured hand over her fiancé's and sigh dramatically about how important it was to do things in the right order. Education first, then career, then marriage, then children. The implication was always crystal clear: I had failed at the most basic sequence of adult life. When Iris was 6 months old and I was surviving on 3 hours of sleep while juggling classes and a part-time job at a legal aid clinic, Vanessa announced her engagement at Sunday brunch with a diamond so large it seemed to have its own gravitational field. My mother wept with joy. My father opened champagne at 10 in the morning, and I sat in the corner with Iris sleeping against my shoulder, trying to hide the spit-up stain on my only decent shirt. The wedding, naturally, was a spectacle that dominated family conversations for an entire year. Vanessa married Graham in a ceremony that cost more than most people's houses, held at an exclusive vineyard with 300 guests, a live orchestra, and flowers imported from Ecuador. I was permitted to attend only after promising my mother that I would leave Iris with a babysitter, as though my beautiful daughter was somehow an embarrassment that needed to be hidden from polite society. I wore a borrowed dress, stood at the edge of family photos, and left before the dancing started because I couldn't afford to pay the babysitter for more than 4 hours. That night, lying in my cramped apartment listening to Iris's gentle breathing from the crib, I made myself a promise I would build something so substantial that no one could ever make me feel invisible again. The years that followed were a masterclass in perseverance, fueled by spite and determination. I finished my undergraduate degree while working 40 hours a week, graduated with honors despite everyone's expectations that I would drop out, and then did something that shocked my entire family: I applied to law school. Not just any law school, but the same prestigious institution where my father had earned his degree 4 decades earlier. When I received my acceptance letter, I felt a surge of vindication so intense it brought tears to my eyes. My father's response was characteristically cold, a brief email stating that he hoped I understood the financial commitment I was undertaking, as he wouldn't be providing support for what he called my impractical ambitions. Law school with a young daughter was like running a marathon while carrying a backpack full of stones. There were nights when Iris would wake up crying from a nightmare just as I was finally understanding constitutional law. There were days when I would see other students discussing internships at prestigious firms over expensive coffee, knowing that my evenings belonged to bath time and bedtime stories rather than networking events. My classmates would complain about being tired from studying until midnight, and I would smile tightly, having been awake until 3 finishing an assignment after Iris finally fell asleep. The isolation was profound, not just from my family who viewed my choices with barely concealed disdain, but from my peers who couldn't understand why I wasn't available for study groups or social gatherings. During those 3 years, family events became increasingly painful obligations. Vanessa had given birth to twins, a boy and a girl named Harrison and Charlotte, and my parents transformed into grandparents, so devoted it was as though they discovered their life's true calling. Every visit to their home in the affluent suburb of Riverside Heights revealed new evidence of their adoration: a nursery decorated by a professional designer, a playroom filled with educational toys that cost more than my monthly rent, photographs covering every available surface. My mother would hold the twins and coo about how blessed Vanessa was, how everything had worked out perfectly because she'd done things the right way. The unspoken comparison to my situation hung in the air like smoke, acrid and choking. Vanessa's life appeared to be a catalog spread for upper-class perfection. She and Graham had purchased a sprawling colonial in the same neighborhood as our parents, complete with a circular driveway, professionally landscaped gardens, and enough bedrooms to house a small army. She didn't work, instead dedicating herself to being a full-time mother and wife, organizing charity luncheons, and serving on the board of the country club. Her social media presence was carefully curated perfection: photographs of the twins in matching outfits, elaborate birthday parties with custom cakes and hired entertainers, vacation photos from European destinations. She would show these images to our mother during family dinners, and they would discuss Vanessa's wonderful life while I helped clear the plates. Meanwhile, Iris and I lived in a 2-bedroom apartment in a neighborhood that my parents referred to as transitional, which was their polite way of saying they were embarrassed by our address. My daughter attended public school while her cousins went to private academy. We shopped at discount stores while Vanessa posted photos of her children's designer wardrobes. Our vacations consisted of camping trips to state parks while the twins visited resorts in Turks and Caicos. But here's what my family didn't see. Iris was brilliant, kind, and remarkably resilient. She understood from an early age that we were building something together, that every sacrifice had purpose. While Harrison and Charlotte were handed everything, Iris learned the value of working for what she wanted. She studied hard, read voraciously, and never once complained about having less than her cousins. I graduated from law school near the top of my class, an achievement that earned me a brief congratulations from my father and absolute silence from Vanessa. The small ceremony felt hollow without genuine family support, but Iris was there in her best dress, holding a bouquet of grocery store flowers, telling me she was proud of me. That moment mattered more than any recognition from my parents ever could. I accepted a position at a mid-size family law firm, starting at the bottom despite my strong credentials, working impossible hours to prove myself while juggling single parenthood. Those early years practicing law were grueling. I would drop Iris at school, work until 6, pick her up from after-school care, help with homework while preparing dinner, then return to case files after she went to bed. Family gatherings during this period followed a predictable and painful pattern. Vanessa would arrive looking effortlessly elegant in designer clothes, her children impeccably dressed and well-behaved in that particular way that comes from having a full-time parent and unlimited resources. She would hold court in my parents' living room, discussing her latest charitable project or the twins' achievements at their elite school. My mother would listen with rapt attention, occasionally glancing at me with what I recognized as disappointment barely disguised as concern. When anyone asked about my work, the questions were perfunctory, the interest feigned. Legal work is so stressful, my mother would say. Don't you think about finding something more suitable for a single mother? The breaking point in our family dynamic, or rather the point where I stopped caring about their approval, came during Thanksgiving when Iris was 8. We had arrived at my parents' house with a homemade pie, the only contribution I could afford, while Vanessa had hired a catering company to provide half the meal. The children were playing in the den, or more accurately, Harrison and Charlotte were playing while Iris sat quietly with a book, having learned from experience that her cousins' toys were not for sharing. I overheard Vanessa talking to our mother in the kitchen, her voice carrying through the house with that particular tone of false sympathy she'd perfected. It's just so sad. Elena can't give her daughter the advantages that children need. Did you see Iris's coat? I think it's from last year. And it's clearly too small. I offered to pass down Charlotte's things, but you know how proud Elena is. She'd rather have her daughter suffer than accept help. My mother murmured something in agreement, and Vanessa continued, voice dropping to a whisper that somehow remained perfectly audible. And raising a child without a father figure, the research is clear about how damaging that is. Harrison and Charlotte are so lucky to have Graham. He's such an involved dad. Always present, always providing. I just hope Iris doesn't end up with too many issues from her unstable home life. I stood frozen in the hallway, my hands clenched so tightly that my nails drew blood from my palms. The casual cruelty of discussing my daughter's supposed deficiencies, the certainty that my sister's life was superior in every measurable way, the complete absence of recognition for everything I had accomplished against impossible odds. It crystallized something inside me.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
I walked into that kitchen, looked directly at Vanessa, and said with perfect calm that we would be leaving. My mother protested weakly about dinner, but I was already gathering Iris and our coats. My daughter, wise beyond her years, didn't ask questions until we were in the car. "Are you okay, Mom?" she asked. I wasn't, but I would be. After that Thanksgiving, I made a conscious decision to distance myself from family obligations. I stopped attending every dinner, every holiday gathering, every carefully orchestrated event designed to showcase Vanessa's perfect life while highlighting my failures. The freedom was intoxicating. Without the constant weight of their judgment, I found I could breathe more easily, think more clearly, focus more completely on building the life Iris and I deserved. My career began to accelerate in ways I hadn't anticipated. I discovered I had a particular talent for family law, especially for representing women in complex divorce cases. My approach was different from many of my colleagues. I understood viscerally what it meant to be underestimated, to have your worth questioned, to fight for stability while others assumed you would fail. My reputation grew steadily through word of mouth and successful case outcomes. Women started specifically requesting me, particularly those dealing with high-net-worth divorces where their husbands assumed they could be intimidated or outmaneuvered. I took cases that other attorneys avoided, situations involving hidden assets, offshore accounts, complex business valuations. I was relentless in my preparation, creative in my strategies, and absolutely ruthless when protecting my clients' interests. Within 5 years, I had made senior associate. Within 8, I was offered a partnership. And just last year, at 37 years old, I became one of the founding partners of a new firm specializing exclusively in high-stakes family law and divorce litigation. The firm, Voss Mitchell & Associates, quickly became known for taking on seemingly impossible cases and winning them. My partner, Jennifer Mitchell, was a brilliant litigator with connections throughout the legal community. Together, we built something remarkable, a practice that combined compassionate client care with aggressive legal strategy, that understood the emotional devastation of divorce while never losing sight of the financial realities. We hired talented attorneys, invested in top-tier investigators, and developed relationships with forensic accountants who could find hidden money in the most elaborate schemes. Our success rate was extraordinary, and our reputation grew accordingly. But I kept all of this carefully hidden from my family. They knew I was still practicing law, still a single mother, still living what they assumed was a modest, struggling existence. They didn't know about the partnership, the 6-figure income that had grown to 7 figures, the penthouse apartment in the city that Iris and I had moved into last year. They didn't know that I drove a luxury sedan, that Iris attended an elite private school on scholarship earned through her own merit, that we traveled to Europe every summer. I maintained the illusion of the struggling single mother, partly because I knew my success would only invite false reconciliation, and partly because some petty part of me enjoyed the secret knowledge of how wrong they were about everything. Iris had grown into an extraordinary young woman. At 15, she was confident, articulate, and possessed a sense of justice that made me think she might follow me into law someday. She understood implicitly that we had created something valuable together through our years of struggle, and she never seemed bothered by the fact that she'd been raised differently from her cousins. In fact, she occasionally expressed relief that she hadn't grown up with the pressure and expectations that seemed to make Harrison and Charlotte anxious and performative. Our relationship was built on honesty, mutual respect, and genuine affection, everything my own family relationships lacked. My contact with Vanessa had dwindled to nearly nothing over the past few years. We exchanged obligatory messages on birthdays, saw each other at major holidays if I bothered to attend, and maintained the thinnest veneer of sisterhood for our parents' benefit. I knew the broad strokes of her life from my mother's updates. The twins were now 14. Graham had been promoted to senior vice president. They'd renovated their already enormous house. Vanessa had started a lifestyle blog that apparently had quite a following. From my perspective, her life looked exactly as it always had, a performance of perfection that required constant maintenance and validation. What I didn't know, what absolutely no one in the family knew, was that 3 months ago, a woman named Catherine Reeves had walked into my office for a consultation. She was 42, devastated, and holding evidence that her husband had been systematically hiding assets and conducting a long-term affair. As she laid out the details of her situation, something began to feel uncomfortably familiar. Her husband was a pharmaceutical executive. They lived in Riverside Heights. He traveled frequently for work but had become increasingly distant. She discovered credit card statements showing purchases at jewelry stores where she'd received no gifts, hotel charges in cities where he supposedly had business, and most damning, text messages to someone saved in his phone under a man's name that were decidedly not professional in nature. When Catherine showed me a photograph of her husband, my blood went cold. Graham Sutherland, my brother-in-law, the man my sister had spent 15 years holding up as the gold standard of husbands and fathers, the provider and devoted family man, was sitting in a hotel bar in that photograph, with his arm around a woman young enough to be his daughter. Catherine explained that she'd hired a private investigator after Graham's behavior became increasingly suspicious: the late nights at the office, the weekend business trips, the password-protected phone he guarded obsessively. What the investigator had uncovered was breathtaking in its scope and audacity. Graham had been conducting an affair with his 28-year-old assistant for the past 3 years. He had established a separate apartment where he housed this woman, paying her rent and expenses through a complex series of transfers designed to hide the money trail. He had opened credit cards in his company's name that he used for personal expenses. Most significantly, he had been systematically moving marital assets into accounts that Catherine didn't know existed, preparing for what appeared to be an eventual divorce where he planned to claim financial hardship. The investigator's report was devastatingly thorough: photographs, financial records, text messages, emails. It painted a picture of a man who had been methodically deceiving his wife while maintaining the image of a devoted family man. I sat in my office that afternoon, Catherine's file spread across my desk, facing an ethical dilemma that made my head spin. Graham was married to my sister. Taking this case meant destroying Vanessa's perfect life, exposing the lie she'd been living, potentially devastating my niece and nephew. It meant family chaos, uncomfortable confrontations, and permanent rifts. But it also meant standing up for Catherine, a woman who deserved fierce advocacy and justice. It meant holding Graham accountable for years of deception and financial manipulation. And if I was being completely honest, it meant finally exposing the truth about the perfect family that had been held up as superior to mine for 15 years. I took the case. I spent the next 3 months building an airtight divorce strategy for Catherine, working with forensic accountants to trace every hidden asset, with investigators to document every instance of Graham's infidelity, with tax experts to understand the implications of his financial misconduct. We discovered that Graham had diverted nearly $2 million from marital accounts, that he'd purchased property in his girlfriend's name, that he'd lied on financial disclosures for his company's stock options. The evidence was overwhelming, and more importantly, it was ironclad. When we filed the divorce papers, we included a motion for temporary orders that would freeze all accounts and require complete financial disclosure. But here's what made the situation particularly explosive: Catherine had discovered that she wasn't Graham's only victim. Through her investigation, she'd learned that Graham had convinced Vanessa to sign various financial documents over the years, including a postnuptial agreement that significantly limited her claim to his income and assets. He told her it was for tax purposes, that his attorneys required it for estate planning. Vanessa, trusting her devoted husband completely, had signed without reviewing the documents with independent counsel. Those signatures, obtained through misrepresentation, were potentially voidable, and the timing suggested Graham had been planning his exit strategy for years. The irony wasn't lost on me. While Vanessa had spent a decade and a half pitying my single status and mocking my life choices, her own marriage had been a carefully constructed fraud. The man she'd held up as the embodiment of stability and provision had been systematically stealing from her, cheating on her, and preparing to leave her in the most financially devastating way possible. And she had no idea. She continued posting photographs of their happy family, attending charity events on his arm, telling anyone who would listen about her blessed life. Meanwhile, Catherine and I were preparing documentation that would shatter everything. The case was scheduled to proceed quietly through the courts, with Catherine requesting confidentiality to protect her privacy and her children. But then something unexpected happened. My mother called to inform me that this year's Christmas Eve dinner was mandatory attendance, that she wouldn't accept any excuses, that it was time for me to stop being so distant from the family. She used that particular tone that brooked no argument, the voice of maternal authority that assumed compliance. Against my better judgment, I agreed to attend. I told myself it was for Iris, who despite everything still wanted some connection to her grandparents. But truthfully, some dark part of me wanted to see Vanessa's performance one more time before everything came crashing down. The week before Christmas, Catherine's case took a dramatic turn. Graham's attorneys, realizing the strength of our evidence, began attempting to negotiate a settlement. But their offers were insultingly low, clearly assuming that Catherine would accept less than she deserved to avoid the embarrassment of a public trial. They didn't know who they were dealing with. Catherine had decided she wanted the truth exposed, wanted Graham to face consequences for his actions. She authorized me to proceed aggressively, to file motions that would make the case public record, to pursue not just divorce but potential criminal charges for financial fraud. The paperwork was prepared and would be served the day after Christmas. I arrived at my parents' house on Christmas Eve with Iris beside me, both of us dressed impeccably. My daughter wore a designer dress I'd purchased specifically for this occasion, and I was in a tailored suit that had cost more than my mother's entire wardrobe but looked understated enough not to attract immediate attention. We brought expensive wine and artisan chocolates, subtle indicators that our circumstances had changed significantly. My mother answered the door with her usual air of resigned tolerance, as though my attendance was an obligation she had to endure rather than a daughter she was happy to see. The house was decorated with its traditional excess, every surface covered in holiday arrangements. A massive tree dominating the living room, candles creating what my mother probably thought was warm ambiance but felt more like a staged photograph. Vanessa was already there, of course, positioned in her favorite chair like a queen holding court. Graham stood behind her with his hand on her shoulder, the picture of a devoted husband. The twins sat nearby on their phones, having reached the age where family gatherings were more obligation than pleasure. No one seemed particularly excited about my arrival, though my father did nod in my general direction before returning to his conversation with Graham about market volatility. Dinner was the usual performance of forced congeniality and thinly veiled judgment. My mother had outdone herself with a menu that required hours of preparation, though naturally she'd had help from a catering company. Vanessa made a point of discussing the wonderful Christmas morning they had planned, the expensive gifts she'd purchased for the twins, the vacation home they'd just bought in Aspen. My mother hung on every word, asking follow-up questions and expressing admiration. When conversation eventually turned to my life, the questions were perfunctory and dismissive. "Still at that law firm, Elena?" my father asked. "Must be difficult managing that kind of schedule as a single mother." I smiled blandly and provided vague answers, watching Graham carefully throughout the meal. He was fidgeting more than usual, drinking more quickly, checking his phone repeatedly. He didn't know that Catherine had hired me specifically. He didn't know that we'd spent 3 months building a case that would destroy him. He didn't know that in less than 24 hours, Process servers would be delivering documents that would expose every lie he'd constructed. The knowledge sat in my chest like a stone, heavy and solid. Vanessa, oblivious to her husband's discomfort, continued her performance of perfect wife and mother, occasionally touching Graham's arm affectionately while describing their blessed life. Then came the moment that would change everything. Dessert had been served, an elaborate Yule log that my mother had special ordered from a French bakery, and conversation had shifted to New Year's plans. Iris mentioned quietly that we might be traveling, and my mother made a dismissive sound. "Where would you possibly be traveling to, Elena?" she asked, her tone suggesting that our travel would naturally be limited to driving distance and budget hotels. Before I could respond, Vanessa laughed, a sound that had always grated on me like nails on glass. "Oh, Mom. You know, Elena doesn't have that kind of flexibility in her life. Some of us have the luxury of planning vacations, and some of us have to focus on just getting by." She turned to Iris with exaggerated sympathy. "It must be hard, sweetie, not having the same advantages that Harrison and Charlotte have. But you've turned out remarkably well considering the circumstances. Your mother has done her best with what she has." The condescension dripped from every word. The implication was clear: I had failed at life while Vanessa had succeeded, and my daughter was somehow disadvantaged because of my choices. Iris's face flushed red, a sign I recognized as barely suppressed anger. But before either of us could respond, Vanessa continued, emboldened by her perceived superiority and my years of silence. "You know what the difference is?" She looked around the table as though sharing profound wisdom. "The difference is stability, commitment, doing things the right way. Harrison and Charlotte have everything they need because they have two parents who put them first, who built a strong marriage before having children." She gestured vaguely at me. "I'm sorry, Elena, but you have to admit that your situation isn't ideal. Iris is a lovely girl, but she's growing up without a father, without that stability. At least my children have a real father who provides for them, who's present in their lives, who models what a good marriage looks like." The silence that followed was absolute. Even my parents, who had spent years tacitly agreeing with this sentiment, seemed uncomfortable with how explicitly Vanessa had stated it. Graham had gone pale, his wineglass frozen halfway to his mouth. Iris was staring at her plate, her hands clenched in her lap, and I felt something shift inside me. A final severing of whatever obligation or hope had kept me tethered to this family's opinion of me. I stood up slowly, smoothing my napkin and placing it carefully beside my plate. Then I smiled, a real smile, and said, "Vanessa, I think there's something you should know about your real father who's so present and committed." The room seemed to hold its breath. Vanessa's expression shifted from smug satisfaction to confusion, then to something that looked almost like fear. My mother's hand went to her throat in that gesture she always made when she sensed social disaster approaching. My father set down his fork with deliberate care, his attorney's instincts clearly alerting him that something significant was about to unfold. Graham had gone completely still, his face now ashen. I reached into my bag, which I'd kept beside my chair throughout dinner, and pulled out my phone. With a few quick taps, I pulled up a photograph and held it where everyone at the table could see. It was one of the surveillance photos from Catherine's case, showing Graham with his arm around a young woman at an upscale restaurant, his hand resting intimately on her lower back. Their faces closed together in a way that left no room for misinterpretation about the nature of their relationship. "This is your devoted husband 3 weeks ago at Marcello's with his assistant, whose name is Jessica Brennan." I turned to look directly at Vanessa, whose face had drained of all color. "They've been having an affair for 3 years. He set her up in an apartment in the city that he pays for through a series of financial transfers designed to hide the expenses from you. He's also been systematically moving marital assets into hidden accounts, preparing for what appears to be his planned exit from your marriage." Graham shot to his feet so quickly his chair tipped backward and clattered against the floor. "That's privileged information," he sputtered, his voice high and strained. "You can't share that. It's unethical. It's a violation of attorney-client privilege." "Actually," I said calmly, "it's not. I'm not your attorney and never have been. This information came to me through representing Graham's wife in her divorce proceedings. His legal wife, Catherine Reeves Sutherland." The name seemed to echo in the silent room. "She filed for divorce last week, And the papers will be served tomorrow morning along with motions that detail every instance of adultery, every hidden asset, every fraudulent financial document you've signed over the past 5 years. Vanessa made a sound like she'd been punched, a gasping wheeze that came from somewhere deep in her chest. Wait, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Wait, what are you talking about? Graham's wife? We're married. We've been married for 16 years. I turned my phone toward her again, this time showing a different document, a marriage certificate from 12 years ago showing Graham's marriage to Catherine Reeves. You've been married for 16 years, I confirmed. Graham has been married to Catherine for 12, which means for the past dozen years, your marriage has been bigamous and therefore legally void. You're not actually married, Vanessa. You never really were. The words hung in the air like smoke from an explosion. My mother made a small, choked sound. My father had gone very still, his legal mind clearly processing the implications. Iris sat with her eyes wide, watching the scene unfold with the fascination of someone witnessing something they'd never imagined possible. And Vanessa just stared at me, her perfect face slack with incomprehension. That's impossible, she finally said, though her voice carried no conviction. We have a marriage certificate. We had a wedding. Everyone was there. You were there. Did you ever file the marriage certificate with the county? I asked, though I already knew the answer from the investigation. Did you personally see it registered? Or did Graham handle all of that paperwork because he was so thoughtful and wanted to take care of those details for you? The truth was written all over her face. Graham had convinced her that he would handle the administrative aspects of their marriage, that she shouldn't worry about the boring paperwork. He'd shown her a certificate that looked official, had framed it and hung it in their home. But he'd never actually filed it because he was already married to someone else. He'd maintained 2 separate lives for over a decade with remarkable precision, 2 wives who never knew about each other, 2 households that existed in entirely different social circles. Graham, is this true? Vanessa turned to him, her voice breaking. Her perfect composure had shattered completely, tears streaming down her face, her carefully applied makeup beginning to run. Tell me this isn't true. Tell me she's lying. Graham looked like he might be sick. He opened his mouth several times without producing any sound, his eyes darting around the room as though searching for an escape route. Finally, he managed to speak, his voice hoarse. Vanessa, I can explain. It's complicated. Things just happened and I couldn't find a way to tell you. You couldn't find a way to tell me? Her voice was rising now, hysteria creeping into her tone. In 12 years, you couldn't find a moment to mention that you were already married? That our entire life together is a lie? That our children are what? Illegitimate? The twins, who had been watching this exchange with growing horror, both started crying. Harrison stood up abruptly and left the room, his footsteps pounding up the stairs. Charlotte wrapped her arms around herself, rocking slightly, her face buried in her hands. The picture of family perfection that Vanessa had so carefully constructed was disintegrating in real time, and I felt a complex mixture of satisfaction and genuine sadness watching it happen. My father found his voice, shifting into the cold, analytical tone he used in court. Elena, what exactly is the legal situation here? What are the implications? I was prepared for this question. I'd spent weeks analyzing every aspect of the case, understanding not just Catherine's position but also how it would affect Vanessa and the twins. The marriage between Graham and Vanessa is legally void due to the existing marriage to Catherine. Vanessa has no legal claim as a spouse to any assets acquired during their relationship. However, she may have claims as a defrauded party, and there are potential criminal charges that could be filed for bigamy, which is a felony in this state. What about the children? My mother asked, her voice thin and strained. What happens to Harrison and Charlotte? They're still Graham's legal children, I explained. Paternity isn't affected by the validity of the marriage. But in terms of inheritance, estate planning, all of that becomes significantly more complicated. And there's the matter of the assets Vanessa believed were marital property, the house, the accounts, the investments. Legally, those belong entirely to Graham unless we can prove fraud, which I believe we can. We? Vanessa's head snapped toward me. What do you mean we? I mean that while I represent Catherine in her divorce, the evidence we've gathered has clear implications for your situation. I can refer you to an excellent attorney who specializes in these kinds of cases, someone who can help you navigate the legal complexities and protect whatever rights you might have. I paused, letting that sink in. Or you can continue sitting here in denial while Graham's attorneys work to ensure that Catherine gets the full protection of the law and you're left with nothing. Vanessa was staring at me with an expression I'd never seen before. Something raw and desperate and utterly lost. All these years, she said quietly, you let me believe my life was better than yours. You let me pity you, judge you, look down on you. And this whole time, you knew something like this was possible. You're a divorce attorney. You've seen situations like this. You could have warned me. The accusation stung, but I understood where it came from. I couldn't have warned you about something I didn't know was happening. I only learned about Graham's double life 3 months ago when Catherine walked into my office, and at that point, I had a professional obligation to my client that superseded any family connection. I looked around the table at my parents, at Graham, at Vanessa's devastated face. But I'll admit that after years of being treated like a failure by this family, there was a certain poetic justice in discovering that the marriage you held up as superior to my choices was actually a complete fraud. That's enough, my father said sharply. This isn't the time for settling old scores. We need to focus on damage control. Graham, you need to leave. Now. Get out of this house before I do something that violates my bar oath. And you need to get yourself the best criminal defense attorney you can find because Elena is right. Bigamy is a serious felony. Graham started backing toward the door, his hands raised in a placating gesture. I never meant for any of this to happen. Things just got complicated. I was going to figure it out. I was going to make it right. You were going to make it right? Vanessa's voice was cold now, shock giving way to fury. How exactly were you planning to make right the fact that you've been living a double life for more than a decade? How are you going to explain to our children that their entire existence is based on a lie? How are you going to make right the fact that you've stolen years of my life? But Graham was already moving, practically running for the door. We heard it slam, then the sound of his car starting and tires squealing as he fled. The silence he left behind was profound and terrible. My mother was openly weeping now. Not the delicate tears she employed for emotional manipulation but genuine sobs of distress. My father sat with his head in his hands, the picture of a man watching his family's carefully maintained facade crumble. Iris touched my arm gently. Mom, she said quietly, maybe we should go. Let them process this. She was right, of course. There was nothing more to be accomplished here tonight, and my presence would only add salt to wounds that were already catastrophically painful. But before we could stand, Vanessa spoke again, her voice hoarse from crying. Why did you come here tonight? She looked at me with genuine confusion. If you knew all of this, why did you show up for Christmas Eve dinner? Why did you sit through the meal and let me humiliate you one more time before dropping this bomb? It was a fair question, one I'd been asking myself since I decided to attend. I came because Mom insisted it was mandatory. I came because some small part of me still hoped that maybe this family could see past their prejudices and judgments. I came because Iris deserves to have grandparents and extended family, even if they've never fully appreciated her. I paused, considering how much honesty this moment required. And I came because I wanted you to know the truth before it became public record. Because despite everything, you're still my sister. And you deserve to hear this from me rather than from strangers. How generous of you, Vanessa said bitterly. How noble to come here and destroy my life in person rather than letting me find out through legal documents. I stood up, gathering my bag and helping Iris with her coat. I didn't destroy your life, Vanessa. Graham did that all on his own. I'm just the person who uncovered the truth. And for what it's worth, I am sorry. Not sorry for representing Catherine, because she deserves fierce advocacy. Not sorry for exposing Graham's crimes, because he deserves to face consequences. But I am sorry that you're hurt, that the twins are hurt, that the life you thought you had turned out to be an illusion you seemed pretty happy to shatter, my mother said, her voice sharp despite her tears. You could have handled this differently. You could have told us privately before taking the case. No, I couldn't, I said firmly. When Catherine came to my office, I had a professional and ethical obligation that superseded family loyalty. And honestly, given how this family has treated me for the past 15 years, I'm not sure why you'd expect me to put your comfort above my professional responsibilities or my clients' needs. We're your family, my father said, as though that explained everything. Are you? I looked around the table at each of them. Because family should support each other. Family should celebrate each other's successes rather than using them as opportunities for comparison. Family should value each other for who they are rather than constantly finding them wanting. I've spent 15 years being the disappointment, the cautionary tale, the failure that all of you use to make yourselves feel superior. And now you want me to protect you from the consequences of Graham's actions? You're being cruel, my mother said. Vanessa is in crisis and you're using this as an opportunity to attack her when she's vulnerable. I shook my head slowly. I'm being honest, maybe for the first time in years. And if that feels like an attack, perhaps you should consider why the truth is so uncomfortable. I looked at Vanessa directly. I will help you if you want help. I'll connect you with attorneys who can navigate this nightmare. I'll make sure you and the twins are protected to whatever extent the law allows. But I won't apologize for doing my job or for finally standing up for myself. Iris and I walked toward the door, leaving behind the wreckage of Christmas Eve dinner and the shattered illusion of Vanessa's perfect life. As we stepped into the cold December air, my daughter squeezed my hand. That was intense, she said. Are you okay? I thought about the question carefully. Was I okay? I'd just blown up my family's holiday, exposed my brother-in-law's crimes, and potentially destroyed whatever remained of my relationship with my parents and sister. But I'd also stood up for my client, protected a woman who'd been victimized by a serial deceiver, and finally refused to accept the role of family failure that had been assigned to me so many years ago. Yeah, I said, surprising myself with the truth of it. I think I actually am okay. We drove back to our penthouse in comfortable silence, the city lights reflecting off the snow that had started to fall. Tomorrow would bring chaos: the serving of divorce papers, Graham's inevitable attempts to minimize the damage, Vanessa's rage and grief, my parents' disappointment and probably blame. But tonight, I felt lighter than I had in years. The weight of seeking approval from people who would never give it had finally lifted. Christmas morning arrived with unexpected peace. Iris and I opened presents in our living room, the floor-to-ceiling windows offering a spectacular view of the city waking up under a blanket of fresh snow. We'd established our own traditions over the years, traditions that had nothing to do with my family's elaborate productions and everything to do with genuine connection and joy. We made pancakes together, watched old movies, and spent the afternoon volunteering at a women's shelter, something we'd done every Christmas since Iris was old enough to understand why it mattered. My phone buzzed constantly throughout the day. Messages from my parents, from Vanessa, from relatives who'd heard various versions of what had happened. I ignored them all, choosing instead to focus on the one relationship that had never been complicated or conditional, the one I shared with my daughter. She was the reason I'd fought so hard, the reason I'd built a career and a life that proved all of them wrong. And she was the reason I could finally walk away from their judgment without looking back. Later that afternoon, I received a call from an unknown number. Against my better judgment, I answered. It was Catherine, my client, calling to thank me for handling the service of papers and to let me know that Graham had already reached out through his attorney attempting to negotiate. He's panicking, she said, and there was grim satisfaction in her voice. His attorney says he wants to settle everything quietly, avoid criminal charges, make this go away. What do you want to do? I asked, though I already knew the answer. I want him to face every consequence of his choices. I want people to know what he did. I want his company to understand that they promoted a man who was committing felony bigamy and defrauding 2 families. Her voice was steel wrapped in velvet. I want him to lose everything, just like he made me and Vanessa lose everything. Then that's exactly what we'll pursue. I'll have my team prepared for full litigation by the end of next week. We'll file for criminal charges, alert the state bar since this affects his professional reputation, and ensure that every asset is properly accounted for. After we hung up, I found myself thinking about Vanessa. Despite everything, despite years of condescension and judgment, I couldn't help but feel empathy for what she was experiencing. She'd built her entire identity around being the successful sister, the one who did everything right, the one whose life was enviable. And in a single evening, all of that had been revealed as fiction. Her marriage was fake, Her security was gone, her children were traumatized, and her sense of self had been completely shattered. My phone buzzed again, this time with a text from an unfamiliar number. "It's Vanessa. Mom gave me your new number. Can we talk?" I stared at the message for a long time, debating whether engaging was wise or simply reopening wounds that needed to heal separately. Finally, I typed back a response. "I can meet you for coffee tomorrow afternoon if you'd like. There's a cafe called Meridian near my office. 2 o'clock. Her response came quickly. "I'll be there. Thank you." The next afternoon, I arrived at Meridian 15 minutes early, a habit from years of never wanting to keep clients waiting. I chose a quiet corner table with a view of the street, ordered coffee, and prepared myself for what was likely to be a difficult conversation. Vanessa arrived exactly on time, and I barely recognized her. The polished perfection I'd grown accustomed to was gone, replaced by a woman who looked like she'd aged a decade in 48 hours. Her hair was pulled back in a messy ponytail, she wore jeans and a sweater instead of her usual designer outfits, and her face was bare of makeup, revealing dark circles under her eyes and skin that was blotchy from crying. She slid into the seat across from me without saying anything at first, just studying my face as though searching for something. Finally, she spoke, her voice raspy and tired. "I don't know where to start." "That's understandable." I kept my voice neutral, professional. "You've experienced a significant trauma, and you're probably still in shock." "I've been going through everything," she said, pulling out her phone and scrolling through what appeared to be photographs. Every document Graham ever asked me to sign. Every financial statement that seemed wrong but that I trusted him to explain. Every time he traveled for work and I never questioned where he was actually going. She looked up at me with eyes that were desolate. How did I not see it? How could I have been so blind? "Abusers and con artists are skilled at manipulation," I said gently. "Graham created an entire alternate reality and maintained it with remarkable consistency. Most people wouldn't have seen through it, especially when they loved and trusted the person lying to them." She laughed, a bitter sound with no humor in it. "Love and trust." I was so busy performing the role of perfect wife that I never stopped to actually examine whether my marriage was real. I was so focused on making sure everyone knew how great my life was that I didn't notice it was all an elaborate fake. She set her phone down and looked directly at me. "You saw through it though. Or at least you weren't fooled by the performance." "I wasn't looking at your marriage through the lens of competition or comparison," I said. "I was focused on building my own life and taking care of my daughter. And if I'm being honest, I'd stopped paying attention to your perfect life because it became too painful to constantly measure myself against it and find myself lacking." "I'm sorry," she said suddenly. And I could see that she meant it. "I'm sorry for all of it. For the years of condescension and judgment. For the comments about Iris not having a father. For using your life as a cautionary tale to make myself feel superior. For everything." It was perhaps the first genuine apology my sister had ever offered me, and I felt something shift in my chest, a loosening of anger I'd carried for so long it had become part of my structure. "I appreciate that. The apology doesn't erase the hurt, but it matters that you recognize the impact of your behavior. Will you help me?" She looked at me with such vulnerability that I barely recognized her. "I know I have no right to ask after everything I've done, but you know family law better than anyone. You understand what Graham did and how to fight it. And I don't know who else to turn to. I can't represent you directly," I explained. "That would create too many conflicts of interest since I'm representing Catherine. But I can connect you with one of the best family law attorneys in the state, someone who specializes in fraud cases, and who will advocate fiercely for you and the twins." "Why are you being kind to me?" she asked, genuine confusion in her voice. "After I've spent years being cruel to you, why would you help me at all?" I considered the question carefully, wanting to give her an honest answer. "Because despite everything, you're still my sister. Because the twins are my niece and nephew, and they don't deserve to suffer for their father's crimes. Because I've spent enough years being angry and bitter, and I don't want to live that way anymore." I paused. "And because helping you doesn't diminish me. I can offer assistance from a position of strength rather than seeking approval or validation." Vanessa nodded slowly, digesting this. "I saw the Forbes article," she said after a moment. "Mom sent it to me last night. I think trying to make me feel even worse about underestimating you. You've built something incredible. Everything I thought about your life was completely wrong. Everything you thought was based on surface appearances and assumptions rather than actual knowledge. I corrected gently. You never asked about my work with genuine interest. You never wanted to know about the cases I was winning or the clients I was helping. You saw a single mother struggling and assumed that was the whole story. I saw what I wanted to see, she admitted. What I needed to see to maintain my sense of superiority. And now my own life has been revealed as the actual struggle, the actual fraud. The irony is almost funny except that it's devastating. We talked for another hour, and in that time something shifted between us. Not a complete healing of old wounds, but perhaps the beginning of understanding. Vanessa shared details of her marriage that she'd never revealed before: how controlling Graham had been, how he'd isolated her from friends, how he'd managed every aspect of their finances with such secrecy that she'd had no real understanding of their true situation. She talked about discovering that the house she thought they owned together was actually solely in Graham's name through a trust she hadn't known existed. The twins are destroyed, she said, her voice breaking again. Harrison won't talk to anyone. He just stays in his room playing video games and refusing to acknowledge what's happening. Charlotte keeps asking me if it's true that I'm not really married, if that means she's not legitimate. She's 14 years old and worried about being illegitimate like we're living in Victorian England. They'll need therapy, I said. Probably family therapy in addition to individual sessions. This kind of betrayal from a parent causes deep trauma that doesn't just heal on its own. I can't afford therapy, Vanessa said flatly. I can't afford anything. The credit cards are all frozen. The bank accounts Graham controlled are inaccessible. I have about $3,000 in a personal account and that's it. Everything else is tied up in his name or in trust structures I don't understand. The attorney I'm going to refer you to works with clients to establish emergency funds and temporary support, I assured her. There are legal mechanisms to ensure you have access to money for basic necessities while the larger financial issues are resolved. You and the twins won't be left destitute. How did you do it? She asked suddenly. How did you survive being a single mother, going to law school, building your career, all while everyone in the family was telling you that you were failing? I had no choice, I said simply. Iris needed me to succeed. And somewhere along the way I realized that their opinion of me didn't determine my worth. Their judgment said more about them than it did about me. Vanessa looked down at her hands, and when she spoke again her voice was barely audible. I wasted so much time. I spent years trying to prove I was better than you when I should have been building something real. I chose a man who looked perfect on paper over genuine connection. I valued appearances over substance. And now I have nothing to show for it except 2 traumatized children and a life that was never actually mine. You have the opportunity to start over, I offered. To build something authentic instead of performative. It won't be easy. And it won't look anything like the life you thought you had. But it can be real. She looked at me with something that might have been hope mixed with terror. Will you tell me how? Not as my attorney, but as my sister. Will you help me figure out how to start over when everything I thought I knew was wrong? And in that moment, looking at my sister's devastated face and remembering all the years of complicated pain between us, I made a choice. Yes, I said. I'll help you. Not by fighting your battles for you, but by showing you that it's possible to rebuild from nothing and create something stronger than what you lost. We exchanged information for the attorney, I recommended, a brilliant woman named Margaret Torres who specialized in cases involving fraud and financial deception. I walked Vanessa through what to expect from the legal process, how to document everything, how to protect herself and the twins during the coming storm. And for the first time in our adult lives, we talked to each other as equals rather than as competitor and conquest. As we were preparing to leave, Vanessa hesitated. Elena, she said, what you said at Christmas Eve dinner about Iris not having a father. I was wrong. She clearly has an incredible parent in you. She's confident and smart and kind in ways my kids aren't despite having every material advantage. You did something remarkable raising her alone, and I should have recognized that instead of using it as ammunition to feel superior. Thank you, I said, and meant it. That acknowledgement, coming from the sister who'd spent years judging my choices, carried weight I hadn't expected. The weeks following Christmas were chaotic in ways I'd anticipated and some I hadn't. Graham's case became increasingly complicated as investigators uncovered even more evidence of fraud, deception, and financial manipulation. It turned out Catherine and Vanessa weren't his only victims. There were business partners he'd deceived, investors he'd misled, and a corporate structure built on lies that was now collapsing under scrutiny. His pharmaceutical company placed him on immediate leave pending their own investigation, and there were rumors that criminal charges would extend beyond bigamy to include securities, fraud, and embezzlement. Catherine's divorce proceeded with brutal efficiency. We'd built an airtight case, and Graham's attorneys knew it. They attempted multiple times to negotiate settlements that would minimize his exposure, but Catherine remained firm in her desire for full accountability. The case would go to trial, and it would be public. She wanted everyone to know what he'd done, wanted other women who might be involved with him to come forward, wanted full transparency about his decades of deception. Vanessa's situation was more complex. The attorney I'd referred her to, Margaret Torres, was brilliant and aggressive in protecting her interests. They filed multiple motions to establish that Vanessa had been defrauded into believing she was legally married, that assets she'd assumed were marital property had been deliberately structured to exclude her, and that Graham's actions constituted not just bigamy but a pattern of financial abuse and manipulation spanning more than a decade. Margaret was arguing for both criminal restitution and civil damages, building a case that Graham had essentially stolen years of Vanessa's life, while preventing her from building her own financial independence. My parents struggled to process the situation. My father, with his legal background, understood intellectually what had happened but seemed unable to reconcile it with the image he'd had of Graham as a successful, stable son-in-law. My mother simply couldn't accept that the perfect family she'd spent years celebrating had been an elaborate fiction. She called me several times, conversations that were awkward and strained, where she attempted both to thank me for helping Vanessa and to express disappointment that I'd handled things so publicly. During one particularly difficult call, I finally said what I'd been thinking since Christmas Eve. "Mom, I understand that this situation is uncomfortable for you, but I need you to understand something. I didn't create this disaster. Graham did. And if you're looking for someone to blame for how it was revealed, blame him for living a double life that was always going to eventually explode. Don't blame me for being the person who uncovered the truth while doing my job." There was a long silence on the other end of the line. "You've become very hard," she finally said. "Very cold." "No," I corrected gently. "I've become very clear about boundaries and about not accepting responsibility for other people's feelings about the truth. There's a difference." Our relationship remained strained, but there was a new element of honesty in it that hadn't existed before. She could no longer pretend that my life was a failure while Vanessa's was a success. She could no longer use me as a cautionary tale or a source of disappointing comparison. The hierarchy our family had operated under for so many years had been permanently disrupted, and we were all learning to navigate new dynamics. Iris watched all of this unfold with the wisdom of someone who'd grown up understanding that appearances could be deceiving, and that real strength came from authenticity rather than performance. One evening as we were having dinner in our apartment, she asked me if I regretted how everything had happened. "Do you mean, do I regret taking Catherine's case?" I asked. "Or do I regret revealing Graham's crimes at Christmas dinner?" "Both, I guess." She twirled pasta on her fork thoughtfully. "I know Aunt Vanessa was awful to us for years, but she's also kind of destroyed now, and the twins are really struggling. Charlotte posted something on social media about trust and betrayal that was really sad." I considered the question carefully, wanting to give my daughter an honest answer that acknowledged the complexity of the situation. "I don't regret taking Catherine's case. She deserved fierce representation and Graham deserved to face consequences for his actions. As for how it was revealed, I'll admit that part of me enjoyed watching Vanessa's perfect facade crumble after years of her using it as a weapon against me. But I'm not proud of that impulse." "So you do regret it?" Iris pressed. "I regret that the twins are hurting. I regret that the revelation was so public and dramatic. But I don't regret refusing to continue playing the role of family failure while accepting treatment I didn't deserve." I paused, searching for the right words. Sometimes standing up for yourself means other people get hurt, especially when they've built their sense of superiority on keeping you diminished. That's uncomfortable and painful, but it doesn't make it wrong. Iris nodded slowly. Grandma said you were being vindictive when you told us that you were settling old scores. Do you think that's what I was doing? I asked, genuinely curious about my daughter's perspective. She thought about it for a moment. I think you were doing your job and also finally telling the truth about how you've been treated. And I think it's possible to do the right thing while also feeling satisfied that people who hurt you are seeing consequences. That doesn't make you a bad person, Mom. It makes you human. Her insight, as usual, cut right to the heart of the matter. She was right. I had been both professional and personal in that moment, both ethical and emotional. The two weren't mutually exclusive, even though part of me felt they should be. The legal proceedings continued through the winter and into spring. Graham's situation deteriorated rapidly as more victims came forward, as financial investigators uncovered additional schemes, as the full scope of his deception became clear. His pharmaceutical company terminated his employment and began their own litigation to recover funds they believed he'd misappropriated. His professional reputation was destroyed. His state bar association opened an investigation into whether his conduct warranted disbarment from practicing pharmaceutical law, and criminal prosecutors were building cases that could result in significant prison time. Catherine's divorce was finalized in April with a settlement that awarded her substantial assets, spousal support, and full documentation of Graham's fraud for potential criminal proceedings. She walked away from the marriage with her dignity intact, and the satisfaction of knowing that Graham would face consequences for years of deception. More importantly, she'd become an advocate for other women in similar situations, working with organizations that helped victims of financial abuse and fraud. She and I remained in contact, and she'd become something of a friend beyond our attorney-client relationship. Vanessa's legal situation was more protracted. Because she'd never been legally married to Graham, she couldn't file for divorce, but Margaret Torres had built a compelling case for fraud, conversion of assets, and intentional interference with her ability to earn income and build financial independence. The civil suit sought damages for the years Vanessa had spent believing she was building a marital partnership while Graham was systematically excluding her from any real financial stake. Additionally, because Graham had convinced Vanessa to sign documents under false pretenses, including quitclaim deeds and beneficiary designations, there were arguments for voiding those transactions based on fraudulent inducement. The twins were in therapy, both individually and together, working through the trauma of discovering their father's double life and the collapse of everything they'd believed about their family. Harrison had grown quiet and withdrawn, while Charlotte had become angry and defiant. Vanessa was doing her best to support them while navigating her own devastation, and I found myself in the unexpected role of supportive sister rather than family outcast. We spoke weekly, sometimes about legal strategy but increasingly just about life, about rebuilding, about discovering who she was beyond the performance she'd maintained for so long. My relationship with my parents remained complicated, but had shifted in fundamental ways. They could no longer dismiss my career or my choices. They could no longer hold up Vanessa's life as superior to mine. The reality of what I'd accomplished, both professionally and personally, was impossible to ignore. My father, in particular, seemed to struggle with reconciling his previous dismissal of my career with the recognition that I'd become more successful than he'd ever been. He started calling occasionally to ask about my cases, about the firm, about my professional opinions on legal matters. It wasn't warmth exactly, but it was respect, and that was something new. My mother's transformation was more gradual and more emotional. She began making efforts to spend time with Iris, trying to build a relationship with her granddaughter that wasn't filtered through judgment about my life choices. She asked questions about my work with genuine curiosity rather than dismissive tolerance. And one afternoon in May, she called and asked if she could take me to lunch. Just the two of us. We met at a restaurant she'd chosen, a quiet French place with white tablecloths and subdued lighting. She was nervous, I could tell, twisting her napkin and rearranging her silverware before finally speaking. "I've been thinking a lot about the past 15 years, she began. About how we treated you after Iris was born. About the assumptions we made about your life and your choices. She looked up at me with tears in her eyes. I was wrong. Elena. We were all wrong. We judged you harshly for having a child, young and alone. And we completely failed to see the strength it took to not just survive but thrive under those circumstances. Thank you for saying that. The acknowledgement meant more than I'd expected. It doesn't change what happened, but it matters that you recognize it. I know I can't undo the damage, she continued. I can't give you back the years when you needed support and received judgment instead. But I'd like to try to build something different now. If you'll let me. I want to know my daughter. Not the version of you I created in my mind, but the actual woman you've become. We talked for hours that afternoon. The longest genuine conversation we'd had in over a decade. She asked about my work, about cases I'd won, about the firm I'd built. She asked about Iris, about her interests and dreams and the remarkable young woman she'd grown into. She asked about my life in the city, about the penthouse I'd purchased, about the travel we did and the experiences we'd collected. And for the first time, she listened without comparing, without judging, without finding ways to diminish what I'd accomplished. The summer brought unexpected changes. Vanessa settled her civil suit against Graham for an amount that would allow her to start over with financial security. It wasn't the married life she'd imagined, but it was foundation enough to build something real. She enrolled in business classes, something she'd always wanted to do but had been discouraged from pursuing because Graham preferred her at home. She started a blog about financial literacy for women, sharing her own story of being defrauded and helping others recognize warning signs of financial abuse. It was vulnerable and honest in ways the lifestyle blog she'd previously maintained had never been, and it resonated with thousands of women who saw themselves in her story. Graham was sentenced to 5 years in federal prison for bigamy, fraud, and financial crimes. His professional reputation was destroyed, his assets were liquidated to pay restitution to his victims, and he faced additional civil suits from business partners and investors. The man who had seemed so powerful and successful was revealed as a sophisticated con artist who'd built everything on lies. The twins struggled with their father's incarceration, but Vanessa handled it with surprising grace, getting them the therapeutic support they needed while being honest about why their father's actions had consequences. As autumn arrived and leaves began turning in the city parks, I found myself reflecting on how much had changed in less than a year. The family hierarchy that had defined my entire life had been permanently disrupted. I was no longer the disappointing middle child, whose choices were cautionary tales. Vanessa was no longer the sister with the perfect life who used my perceived failures to bolster her own sense of superiority. My parents were no longer the arbiters of success whose approval I desperately sought. We were simply people, flawed and complicated, trying to navigate relationships that had been built on false foundations and attempting to construct something more authentic in their place. Iris thrived through all of this chaos. She'd been accepted to several prestigious universities and was carefully considering her options. She'd watched me build a career and a life on my own terms, and she was determined to do the same. She'd also watched the dissolution of Vanessa's seemingly perfect family and learned valuable lessons about the difference between appearance and reality, between performance and authenticity. She was wise beyond her years, empathetic without being naive, strong without being hard. Christmas approached again, and this time the family gathering looked completely different. We met at a restaurant rather than my parents' house, a neutral location that didn't carry the weight of previous disappointments. Graham was conspicuously absent, serving his sentence. The twins were there, quieter and more serious than they'd been a year ago, but also somehow more genuine. Vanessa had changed in visible ways, less polished but more present, less concerned with appearances and more focused on substance. My parents were making efforts, awkward sometimes but sincere, to build relationships with both their daughters rather than playing favorites. The gift exchange was simple and thoughtful rather than competitive and showy. No one was trying to prove anything through expensive displays. No one was being excluded or overlooked. It wasn't perfect, and the wounds of past years hadn't magically healed, but it was honest in ways our family gatherings had never been before. As I looked around the table at these complicated people who shared my history, I realized that the empire I'd built wasn't just professional success or financial security. It was the internal foundation of self-worth that allowed me to engage with them from a position of strength rather than seeking validation I might never receive. The overlooked middle child had become a woman who could no longer be diminished by others' perceptions. The single mother who'd been pitied and judged had built something remarkable through determination and skill, and the family that had once been defined by hierarchy and performance was slowly, painfully, learning to value authenticity over appearances. The journey hadn't been easy, and the destination wasn't perfect, but it was real, and that made all the difference. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.